Stand-up comedy is the personification of science.
Thank you. Good night. My name is Harold Bay.
Hello, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Global Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center located in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome to this series of YouTube videos entitled The Science of Stand-Up. In this YouTube video, we're going to be talking about content and what is funny. What is funny? We're going to get engaged in a discussion of the neurobiology and the evolutionary underpinnings of the science of stand-up. This YouTube video is one of a series of YouTube videos where we demonstrate the intersection of the science of stand-up with other sciences. We started off with a discussion of my research experience as well as my stand-up comedy experience. From there, we went on to talk about how the science of stand-up integrates with theoretical physics, the literary arts, psychology, psychiatry, the social sciences, including racism, free speech, cancel culture, forgiveness. And then we talked about motivational sciences with regard to expectations and objectives. And then we got pretty granular and talked about how to prepare a stand-up comedy routine and how do you start a stand-up comedy routine. We went through all of those things. In this particular presentation, we're going to be talking about content. What is funny? So here's the fundamental question. What is funny? What is funny? What is funny? Now, you would think that if you're going to do stand-up comedy for a living, or even if it's not for a living, if you're just going to do stand-up comedy, then you need to know the answer to this question. You need to be the expert. You need to be the expert. If you're a stand-up comic, you need to be the expert on what is funny. So to get us started, let's look at this quote from E.B. White. Humor can be dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process and the innards are discouraging to any but the purely scientific mind. Well, folks, I'm telling you right now, not going to be anything funny about this video. Okay? Nothing funny about this at all. Because yes, I'm absolutely going to dissect it in a way that it dies in the process. Because the name of this series of YouTube videos is The Science of Stand-Up, and that's exactly what I'm going to explore. So why is it that it is so difficult to define what is funny? Well, first off, folks, it's just complicated. Just look at the reactions that people have to things that are funny and things that are not funny. It's not consistent. It's hard to figure out how to get from point A to point B if point A and point B keep moving around. Let's take an example. Laughter or a smile is not always the response to something funny. For example, there are a lot of reasons why people laugh or they smile. Sometimes they do it as a defense mechanism. It's a response to being frightened or being frustrated or having anxiety or having stress or being incredulous. How many times have you or how many times do you know someone that says something like, okay, that's fine. You do whatever you want. Okay? I don't care. It's your problem. You think you're going to do it that way? Okay, by me. Right? Now, what are they doing there? They're chuckling when, in fact, nothing funny about what's going on at all. They're being incredulous. Sometimes silence or grimace is the reaction to something funny. If somebody says something really funny and you turn around and look at them, sometimes you'll just do this. What? You'll just go. And it'll just be silence. Or if somebody says something funny, you might just as well say something like, you might growl at them. You might grimace. And that's your response to something funny. It could be silence. It could be a growl. It could be a grimace. Finally, happiness and joy is not always reflected by laughter and smiles. How many times you've seen somebody that's very happy and they cry? They cry in response to being happy. So the bottom line is, if you look at just these three simple examples, folks, it's complicated. Humor, comedy, and people's reaction to it is complicated. But I'm going to try to simplify it for you. So let's just look at some history, okay? Some historic examples about comedy. Here is a divine comedy. Divine comedy as written by, as written in Dante's Inferno. And here in Dante's Inferno, you got Dante there, and he's descending into hell. And he finds that a soul's location in hell is based upon the sins that are committed. And if you look at the list on the left, as best I can determine, this is the order of deadly sins, worst to last, okay? Worst to least worst. Now, look, I understand pride is really bad. If it were me, I might move wrath up a little on the list. I just think if somebody commits wrath against me and I am terminally injured or something, that's a deadly sin. But nonetheless, I'm not here to disparage Dante or even question the guy. I'm just saying these are the seven deadly sins, and it's included in this narrative entitled Divine Comedy. So I want you to keep this in mind. Divine comedy when we talk about seven deadly sins. There are theories of humor. I'm not the first one to come up with a theory of humor. Here's one. This was published in 2017, where humor originates from arousal theory, where humor elicits a favorable interaction between thought and emotion. Then there is dispositional theory or superiority theory, where belittling others causes one to feel superior. And then there are incongruities or resolutional theory, where resolution of a inconsistency forms the basis of comedy or humor. Given my stand-up comedy experience and given my read of the literature, I believe that there are 6 domains of the funny. And I want you to really think about this. All you stand-up comics out there, I think I got this down. I think I got it nailed. So here they are, the 6 domains of the funny. Number 1, hedonic. Hedonic comedy. This is where the comedy is focused upon the 4 F's of pleasure. This includes fighting, fleeing, feeding, and fornication. Right? How many times you heard comedy bits? Fighting, fleeing, feeding, and fornication. Here are a lot of comics zero in right on these things. Number 2, eudaimonic. Eudaimonic comedy. This is good spirit or happiness of a life well lived. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. Now, where did they get the name? So a lot of people would think, demon, demonic, demon would be a evil spirit. Daimonic is mainly just spirit. Okay, so you means good or true. So a true spirit or a good spirit could, be favorable and therefore consistent with comedy. Number 3, the extraordinary, and then problem solving, and then accentuating or identifying differences among us, or identifying commonalities among us with respect to community. So let's get to hedonic humor, hedonic domain of the funny. As I mentioned, it's the 4 F's. So it'd be fight, like slapstick or physical comedy, flight, as in surprise, food, or sex. And then if you looked at anxiety and stress, that would be pre-fight or pre-flight. Now, folks, I think you're going to have to agree with me here that there are some comics who are definitely hedonic comics. And this is pretty much their only domain. Okay? This is their lane, all right? Being an hedonic comic. This is as far as they go. They limit their humor to things like bodily functions, toilets, defecation, excrement, menses, and as I mentioned, sex, that sort of thing. And that's when you get comics that use a lot of blue material and such, blue language, blue topics. This is hedonic comedy.
So I'm reading this thing about aloe. And one of the medicinal purposes, you can read this in like the herb book, I guess is what it's called. One of the medicinal purposes of aloe is the fact that it cleans the colon. Why would you want to do that? I mean, you read these things and you go, what would possibly possess you to want to clean your colon? I mean, let's take this as an analogy, okay? This is an analogy. You're going to have to bear with me on this one, okay? Let's say, for example, that you have a dirty carpet, okay? Now, if you want to vacuum your carpet, it's just going to get dirty again. But if you're having a company coming over, it's probably okay to vacuum your carpet, okay? Let's say you have a dusty cabinet, all right? Now, if you want a dusty cabinet, you know it's just going to get dusty again. But if you're planning on having company coming over, it's probably okay to dust your cabinet, right? Okay. Why would you want to clean your colon? Unless you are planning on having company in your colon.
Now, I know a lot of you are saying, well, the way you phrase it there, it sounds like you're being sort of elitist. Well, maybe I am, and maybe it is sort of snobbish to point this out, but folks, it's the science. There are scientifically proven differences between how different people react to different types of comedy. For example, here's a study that was done in 2016, or reported in 2016, where they looked at the altered sense of humor in dementia. Okay, so they took patients with dementia and they determined if they responded differently to comedy than those people without dementia. And so they took one of these examples of hedonic comedy, in this case slapstick, and what they found was people with dementia really didn't respond that much differently to the hedonic comedy than anybody else. So I guess what I'm saying is that hedonic comedy can appeal across a variety of different intellects. However, those with dementia had less appreciation for satirical and absurdist comedy. In other words, the higher forms of comedy they didn't get. Okay? So when I speak of using lower cognitive brain function and higher cognitive brain function in identifying who may or may not respond to comedy, that isn't just my opinion. It's not me being elitist. It's not me being a snob. It's the science. And this is the science stand-up. All right, what about eudaimonic comedy, the domain of eudaimonic comedy? Well, here we're talking about storytelling, meaning, purpose, remembrances, anecdotes, role-playing, these types of things. Things like remember the good old days, that sort of thing. So that would be an example of comedy within the eudaimonic domain.
See, men versus women, man versus women. You know, I tell you the problem here. The problem is here, I think it's come a time. The time has come when I think guys, particularly guys, got to take responsibility here, have got to be a little bit more emotional. A little bit more romantic. Don't you think, ladies? Wouldn't it be nicer? Yeah. And I think it's... Oh. Hell no! No. Just give me some more grease so I can rub on my t-shirt down here. But I think it's going to happen. I think what you're going to find is in the 1990s, I think there's going to be a whole revolution, particularly in music. People are going to be more sensitive. There's going to be more social messages. And I'll tell you who it's going to come from. It's not going to come from people raised in the 60s or raised in the 80s. It's going to come from those people that were raised in the 70s. What else do they have to live for? You know what I'm saying? Because if you were raised during the 60s or 80s, you had something to be proud of. But what are you going to tell your kids if you were raised in the 70s? Yes, son, I was raised in the 60s. Richard Nixon was president, used to wear my hair on down here, had tie-dye t-shirts, bell-bottom jeans, used to listen to Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles all day long. It was a fulfilling childhood. Yes, son, I was raised in the 80s. We went through the Reagan Revolution, had the dissolution of the Cold War, saw reduction in nuclear arms. We used to listen to the talking heads all day long. Same as it ever was. It was a fulfilling childhood. Yes, son, I was raised during the 70s. Jimmy Carter was president. I used to wear pastel leisure suits, gold chain around the neck. Used to listen to Barry Manilow and disco all day long. I did this a lot. But I think it's going to happen. You're going to find these people that are going to come up with the music. They're going to come up with music that, for example, see in the 80s was good music, but it didn't have any meaning, any social message. Not like it did in the 60s. We got any 60s fans out here? Yeah. I'll give you exactly what I'm talking about. In the 80s, we had a band called In Excess. Yeah. Hey, good band. They came up with a love song in the 1980s. I need you tonight, because I'm not sleeping. There's something about you, babe, that makes me sweat. Kind of a real tearjerker that one is. And philosophy, oh, we had all kinds of philosophy in the 1980s. We had philosophy like Edie Brickell and the New Bohemians. Well, there you had yourself some philosophy. I'm not aware of too many things, but I know what I know, if you know what I mean. So shove me into shallow water before I get too deep. Because what I am is what I am. And what you are, or what? Not exactly poor dead in Ohio, is it? See, what we need is direction. We need direction, like John Lennon. John Lennon gave us direction. John Lennon told us to follow her down by the fountain, where rocking horse people eat marshmallow pie. I think we all knew what he was talking about there, huh? And do we have any Motown fans out here? Yeah, Motown. Motown's the only music in the past 4 decades that appreciated the total dimensions of the woman. My baby long, great gosh almighty, my baby tall. My baby she long, my baby she tall, she sleeps with her head in the kitchen, her feet out in the hall. And I think all of us remember that cryptic message. That cryptic message, it's proven itself true for the past 2 decades. About Frank Zappa, when Frank Zappa told us, looked us right in the eye, and he said, watch out where the huskies go. Hey. Don't you eat that yellow snow. Thank you, good night. My name is Harold Bays.
Then there is the extraordinary, the unexpected. Folks, we love to laugh at the unexpected. And we laugh at the unexpected in 2 different ways involving 2 different neural pathways. First, there is involuntary laughter when exposed to the extraordinary or the unexpected. And this, not a lot of involvement of higher brain function here. This is just basically a reaction, like a self-reaction, a quick reaction, using lower cognitive parts of the brain. This would be if someone came up behind you and surprised you, like at a surprise party, and they say, surprise, and then you would start laughing. Now, why are you laughing? Why would you laugh if someone frightened you? Why would you do this? Folks, it's just a defense mechanism. These things, hopefully one of the things you're going to gather through this entire presentation of the science of stand-up with regard to content and the origin of the funny, one of the universal themes here is we need comedy to handle our lives, to handle the stresses in our lives. It's a perfectly normal response or mechanism to handle stimuli. And as I will mention towards the end, I fear sometimes people think we should let that go. We should suppress that. And I think that's potentially dangerous. It's not just dangerous to individuals, but might be dangerous to society. So let's continue on with involuntary laughter as a result of the extraordinary. Shock and fear, like people on a roller coaster. I mean, why are people laughing when they're on a roller coaster? Why is that funny if they're scared? Why are they laughing? Have you ever thought about that? Haunted houses, wonderment. Why would people smile and laugh at a magic show? I mean, that's not a joke. Or juggling, or music, or people who use props, or people who are just amazed at athletic feats. A person shoots a mid-court shot in basketball and makes it. Well, everybody just stands up and cheers, and they're smiling and they're happy. Why? What's funny about that? Why are they joyous about seeing people with athletic feats? Yet again, it's an underappreciated reaction that people have to the unexpected. But then there are voluntary responses. And here, it's when there's a surprise, a cognitive, a higher brain function surprise. The unexpected, an epiphany. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. An epiphany. They just figured it out. Or maybe there's a parody and you have to go through some mental gymnastics to figure out why it's funny. Or maybe the same thing can apply to imitation or improvisation. Improvisation. Why is improvisation funny? Because people are amazed. It's the unexpected. Little known facts, for example. Sometimes people really enjoy hearing about those. Or topical events, or hyperbole, or exaggeration. Again, all sorts of unusual events or happenings and such. If it utilizes the higher brain functions, then this would be an example of a voluntary response to the extraordinary. So here's an example of a almost an involuntary response, because it's not going to require very much brain function. If somebody says, I just flew in from Atlanta and boy are my arms tired. I mean, that doesn't take a lot of brain power to figure that one out. So that would be on the lower brain function when you're talking about the unexpected, right? But on the higher end, you have non sequitur. You may have noticed that I have this quote on the slides before each of these sections that says, I am a binary man in a rainbow world. And then right beside it is computer code with a bunch of ones and zeros and such. Now, I'm not going to go through what that means or what I intended, but if you try to figure that out, that is going to be using higher brain function. And then what about jarring segues? Well, if you didn't mean to have a jarring segue, then maybe that's involuntary, where you kind of go, oh, then that's a reaction. But what if the comic, as I described before in one of the prior YouTube videos on the science of stand-up, sometimes a jarring segue is intentional. It's intentionally jarring for comedic purposes, as a comedic device. And in that case, if the jarring segue is being employed as a comedic device, then this becomes a voluntary response, a voluntary laughter, because you're figuring out that jarring response was making fun of jarring responses, right? It was unexpected, but it was intentional, and it's a device, and you're having to figure that all out. So now you are using higher brain functions, and that becomes a voluntary response. Which brings me to one of the very first videos where we talked about the implementation of 50 common literary devices within stand-up comedy. And in order to understand the application of these literary devices, you're probably going to have to use higher brain function, right? And then, of course, there's other comedy techniques as well as experimental comedy.
What it is. Yeah, I'm cool. I'm cool and I got a hat. I'm a cool cat in the hat. I remember when I first met him. His name was Sam.
semi-eh.
And there I stood on the rocky edges of a distant cloud, and the three bees, the one-eyed sailor, and the dog with no teeth said, "Don't touch that door, lest it might be disturbing." And I said, "Yes, it is disturbing." I like to do a song I wrote. Flintstones, it's the Flintstones. It's a modern Stone Age family. Born in the town of Bedrock, it's placed right out of history.
Dealing with a heckler? Dealing with a heckler is the extraordinary. Because I know people don't like hecklers. I think a lot of comics don't like dealing with hecklers and such. But the reason an audience often likes to be there when there's a heckler is because they know this is an extraordinary event. It's an event that will never happen again. There will never be a comic in that situation that will encounter that heckler again. And if the stand-up comic handles them very well, then that is a unique experience. It is extraordinary, and it will become comedy.
How many people out here been to jail before? Yeah. Back off! Do you realize if you're put in jail, an attorney will represent you for $1,000? What the hell was that? If you're put in jail, Spike Jones up here. What the hell's going on? You know. Spike Jones fans out here. I like that. How many audience would know who Spike Jones is? How many? I love you people. Oh, who is he, guy? She sang with Randy Travis, I think he does. They did a duet, wow. Forever and ever, amen. That was good. An attorney. We've lost total control, huh? I had this neatly planned act tonight and it's completely out of control here. An attorney.
Improvisation obviously is going to be using a lot of high brain function, both to perform it and to understand it. There is the misdirection, or the unexpected twist, the topper, the tag, the throwaway line, the callback. These are all things we covered in the definitions, in the definition section of the Science of Stand-Up. And the whole basis for them being funny is the fact that they are unexpected or they are extraordinary. And then finally, we talked about other comedy techniques that can enhance the extraordinary, such as inopedatus technica, the unexpected use of technical terms, or polycontinuo verbism, choice and delivery of words, and these types of things. Folks, the point is this: a thesaurus can be a comic's friend because it allows you to use word choices that maybe are unexpected and thus make a otherwise medium bit a very strong bit. And here's just a slide from a prior YouTube video in the Stand-Up Definitions Part 2, where again went through 50 literary devices and demonstrated how they could be incorporated within a comedy routine. Now, having said all this, I think that this conclusion from this article is correct. The name of this article is "The Complexity of Jokes is Limited by Cognitive Constraints on Mentalizing." In other words, The degree a comedy bit is perceived to be funny depends on the intent of the comic and the applicability to and the mentalization of the audience. In other words, it's got to apply to the audience. There's got to be some potential connection there. And if you can make it both unexpected and applicable, that's when you develop the funny. Next domain, problem solving. Folks, as human beings, we just love to solve problems. And thank goodness we do, because that is how we advance as individuals, and that's how we evolve as a society. We solve problems. That's what we do. So clearly there is evolutionary and individual advantages to knowing how to solve problems. And if comedy can help us solve problems, then that helps explain why it is we even have comedy to start with. Why do we even need the funny? Well, here's an example why it helps us solve problems. Here's an example of comedy that involves problem solving. Resolution of incongruities, a joke, puns, brain teasers, analytical challenge followed by accomplishment, which is an individual or collective realization with delayed audience response. How many times, I'm talking to you comics out there now, how many times you told a joke, it was a little bit subtle, you kind of stood back, and then it took a little while, but suddenly the audience realized what you were saying, what you were talking about. They finally understood the bit, the joke, and then there was this wave of laughter as people realized what you said. Well, they solved the problem. At first, they were perplexed, like, what did you mean? But when they figured it out, they solved the problem, then it was funny. And most of all, one of the true powers of comedy, one of the true powers of the science of stand-up is making sense of the senseless. One of the true powers of the science of stand-up is making sense of the senseless. And I hope we never lose that. Because if we lose that, I think we lose an important defense mechanism, not just for individuals, but for societies. All right, so to what degree is a joke going to be funny? Well, isn't it interesting that, at least according to this article in 2016, that humor or a joke, the response to a joke is going to be enhanced when there's greater incongruity between expectations and outcomes. In other words, the more the joke has an unexpected punchline, then the funnier the joke. That's what they're trying to say. The degree of the funny is the chasm between the pre-joke mentalization of how best to resolve a problem, so that's the joke setup, followed by an incongruous resolution, which is the punchline. I think that's an important point to make if you're going to be developing content for a stand-up comedy routine. Here's the most basic of all problem solving within the domain of problem solving, and that would be the joke, right? The joke. Why did the chicken cross the road? Well, that's a problem. Now you got to solve it. Why do you rob banks? That was Willie Sutton, a bank robber. Of course, his response, that's where the money is, right? So it's a kind of an unexpected response. I think most people would have, when they say, why do you rob banks? They were looking for more of a psychological evaluation in Willie Sutton's head, but instead, he gave a very concrete sort of answer that might have been unexpected and thus falls within the domain of problem solving with regard to being funny. How many Icelanders does it take to screw in a light bulb? I mean, you've heard a million jokes like that. Or a rabbi, a priest, and accountant walk into a bar. Again, the listener is expected to try to sort out or figure out what the punchline is going to be, and that's problem solving. Another example of problem solving would be puns or wordplay. Here's just some wordplays. Need an ark to save 2 of every animal? I know a guy. So that's just wordplay. Ever since I swallowed some food coloring, I feel like I died a little inside. Solve the problem. I wasn't going to get a brain transplant, but I changed my mind. You're going to have to solve the problem to figure out why that's funny. And then, of course, there's the knock, knock, who's there? Well, now you got to figure out who's there. Problem solving. As I mentioned before, comedy can make sense of seemingly senseless life experiences. We used to be able to say that tragedy plus time equals comedy. Nowadays, in 2021, I think there's an assault on that. We'll talk more about that later on. There's other different types of humor out there that are dark or gallows humor, and just playing on the fact that sometimes we're just trying to make sense of the senseless. That's all they're trying to do. Nobody's trying to make fun of the victims in a very real sense. Because comedy is a way that we have developed from an evolutionary standpoint to sort out and balance the most common frustrating life challenges. We need comedy. We need humor to help us deal with life stressors. Now, I want you to look at this list here. Here's a list of what I believe to be 7 of the most common stressors that we have in our lives. And if you look at each and every one of these, you probably know a joke or somebody that has made a joke about all of these. And what are some of the 7 most frustrating things in our lives? Stressors. Pretentiousness or disrespect. I can't think of any greater stressor in my life than being disrespected. I think that's the worst. Jealousy, anger, laziness, selfishness, excess, and covetousness. Okay? Now, what's really interesting here, if you think about it, I mean, what else stresses you in your life beyond what I just listed here? I'm talking about people to people. People to people. I don't mean like life stress. I don't mean like event stressors. We'll talk more about that later on. I'm just talking about person-to-person stressors. I think this list of 7 covers about all of them. And isn't it interesting that you could tie each and every single one of these to Dante's 7 deadly sins? Pretentiousness and disrespect. I mean, that's pride. Jealousy, envy, anger, wrath, laziness, sloth, selfishness, greed, excess, gluttony, covetousness, lust. So now I think that helps us better understand why it is that, back in the day, they used to refer to these types of things as comedies. Okay, again, the term comedy is really not intended to be used in the way that we would normally think of comedy, but I think there are some analogies here. Because comedy and stand-up, and particularly as reflected by stand-up, helps us solve problems, such as injustice. So here's some triggers we have in our lives. I mean, folks, hypocrisy, human rights, unfairness, prejudice, discrimination, inequality, disparities, marginalization, oppression. How do we deal with these things? So these aren't just interpersonal annoyances, interpersonal stressors that we have in our lives. And these are major societal problems. And how do we solve these problems? Well, many times not solved by politicians, not solved by business. How do you talk about it? How do you deal with these triggers? Many times we deal with them through comedy. And it's the stand-up comic that can sometimes take these injustices and frame them in a way that makes them easier to deal with, right? That's a time-honored tradition in stand-up, is to deal with social injustices. So what are these sorts of responses from a stand-up, from a science of stand-up perspective? First, offer very simple solutions. And that's what comedy does. We offer a solution that's, of course, ridiculous, but it's simple, and it gives us instantaneous relief, and at least for that moment, we feel better. We smile, we laugh about it, and we feel better. It's a coping mechanism. Rage against the machine, stick it to the man, challenge authority, question the establishment, get even, deconstruct social norms, disrupt the status quo, engage in sarcasm, All of these things are things that are intimately incorporated in certain types of stand-up. When I did stand-up comedy, I did a lot of socio-political comedy. And all those things there on the right, that's exactly what I did. I employed each and every one of these responses to address these triggers of hypocrisy, problems with human rights, unfairness, prejudice, discrimination, inequality, disparities, marginalization, and oppression. And folks, as I said before, I was able to do that through stand-up. And I hope future generations of stand-up comics, hope they're not going to lose that ability. Hope they're not going to lose that option, because I think that will be detrimental to us as individuals and to we as a society. With specific regard to sarcasm, this has been evaluated, studied. Here's a quote from Oscar Wilde that said, "Sarcasm is the lowest form of wit, but the highest form of intelligence." So yes, sarcasm can be funny, and sarcasm can also help point out all the problems that we talked about on the prior slide. Now, strictly from a scientific standpoint, sarcasm can instigate conflict. So it is true that if people are just if they just respond to everything they say with just sarcasm, that can instigate conflict. So that would be bad. Conversely, sometimes sarcasm can increase creativity for expressors and recipients. It brings forth more possibilities, a creative atmosphere for more possibilities. And so, yes, I understand there's downsides to sarcasm, but there are upsides as well. Hope we don't lose it. All right, the next domain are differences. One of the staples of stand-up comedy is to point out differences among individuals and societies and all that sort of stuff. And yes, it does employ the use of incongruities and annoyances, and claims of superiority or inferiority. It can be demeaning or disrespecting. It can involve embarrassing others. So here are differences that we have in our society and among individuals. And these differences are differences in demographics, location, characteristics, and others. Look at the other list. Differences in religions and politics and socioeconomic status, marital status, family status, job, life choices, life experiences, ethical beliefs, ideologies, celebrity status, all these types of things. I'll bet if you look at this list that you can point to a specific joke or a specific stand-up comic who has made a joke about each and every one of these. And back in the day, you could do that with the understanding that within the science of stand-up, they were just jokes, folks. They were just jokes. People just trying to be humorous, trying to be funny. Nowadays, as has been said in past YouTube videos on the science of stand-up, we live in a time where walking through the field of stand-up comedy can be a landmine. Because I think it doesn't take too much imagination to understand that any one of these, being funny about any one of these, could potentially offend somebody. And the question is, if a person is offended, what happens then? We're going to talk about that.
And now the courts have decided that the SAT, this is unbelievable. Correct me if I'm wrong about this. The courts have decided that the SAT scores are discriminatory against women. I read that because what kind of mamby-pamby? It's absolutely true, completely discriminatory against women. One of the math questions was, and I read it, one of the math questions was, if there are 3 items on sale for $500 apiece, and you have a $1,000 limit on your credit card, will say 2. A woman will say, hey, 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 hey. Raise that limit to $1,500. They believe this. It's not that women are wrong. They just think a little differently than guys. For example, a guy might say, honey, I'm a little depressed. Let's go to punchlines, have a few laughs. Makes sense. Women just as likely say, honey, I'm a little depressed. Let's go to a movie like Terms of Endearment so I can cry my eyes out. Nothing like the tragedy of another human being to brighten a woman's day. Have you ever noticed that, guy? And women are always saying things like, men can't communicate, men can't communicate. Well, I think we could communicate if we knew what the hell you were talking about half the time. And then because they know I deal with hormones, they hit me with that next one. And not only that, Dr. Bays, why is it that I suffer from severe PMS? Well, you know as well as I do that PMS stands for premenstrual syndrome, implying that it only occurs before the menstrual cycle. Well, there's another condition out there. Another condition I like to call EMS. The eternal menstrual syndrome. These are women that are pretty much hacked off all the time, okay? And you know who you are. Right out here, I can see you. We can open up an EMS support group in this room, I believe. We absolutely could. Yes. So I'm not making fun of women, but you know, there's some of these things that I just find unbelievable. Like, for example, ladies, how hard can it be to remember what kind of surgeries you've had? How hard can you remember what kind of organs you have had removed from your body? You know, this is free advice, absolutely free. You can take it home, I'm not going to charge you a cent. Ladies, once a year, you ought to take inventory on your body. Once a year, figure out kind of like how many organs you started out the year with. How many you got now? Subtract a 4 from the latter, that's how many you had taken out. Okay, it's that simple. Do you know how frustrating it is to be examining a woman and saying, well, Miss Jones, you appear to have a large midline abdominal scar. What kind of surgery did you have? Well, I don't know. Well, did you have your uterus taken out, your ovaries taken out? Well, I don't know. How can you not know? Well, the doctor didn't tell me. You like in there in that conversation, huh? Oh, you people have got nothing to do tomorrow. Why don't you just drop on by the OR and, oh, what are you going to do, doctor? Oh, don't worry your pretty little head about that. We're going to be taking out some organs.
It's even reflected in the gifts that you buy. For example, ladies, you want to make a guy happy. You want to make him happy, give him something practical. Go out and give him a power tool. Yes, I love my wife. She went out and got me a power tool. Think I'm going to build me a desk. Maybe next year she'll give me an axe. All I needed was a myth. I'm a legend. But guys, the next time your wife or girlfriend has an anniversary or birthday, just try to buy her something practical. Go out and buy her a dustbuster.
And I have learned when you talk about advice, men and women react very differently. For example, men, as in life, just don't have a clue. You know what I mean? Just not a clue. Because there's at least one area in which men are infinitely less logical than women. And that's in the area of sports. Because guys get involved in sports, all reality just blasts out of the brain, you know? I used to belong to the YMCA in the span of 1 year. I sprained my ankle 3 times. Each time it's the same thing. Now this has happened to each and every guy in here. Ankles swollen the size of a melon. Bony fragments are just flying out everywhere. That ankle apparatus is holding by that single tendon. And do I seek professional medical advice? No. I listen to some high school dropout at the gym. Who comes over and goes, well, you know what you ought to do with that? You ought to just walk that off. I get the sweat down some vice grips I got back in the car, huh? The point here is men do not respect physical injury. Do not respect it. For example, guys are shaving, cut yourself. What do? Cover it with toilet paper. Because nothing will initiate that clotting cascade quite like a roller Charmin. Well, fellas,
And then, of course, there's a commonality. The last domain is commonality, where a stand-up comic will talk about shared annoyances, shared experiences, those types of things. And that's just observational comedy, right? That's observational comedy right there. Hear it all the time. All right, so what is the physiology of laughter? Why do people laugh, or how do they laugh? Or what's the neurobiology? Well, first of all, you got to have a sensory input. And from a stand-up comic, that's mostly going to be sight and hearing. You're going to see a comic, you're going to hear a comic, and then that's going to be processed through your brain. Having said this, folks, laughter or humor can also be transmitted through touch or taste or smell. Give an example of what I'm talking about. Somebody comes up and tickles you. That's just touch, but that's going to be stimulating parts of your brain where you're going to be laughing. Now, maybe it's an involuntary laugh, but nonetheless, it still represents sensory input with the output of the recipient being laughter. How many times have you had people that have tasted something or smelled something and then they smile? Okay, it's pleasurable or whatever. Well, yet again, this is the sensory input. It gets processed by the brain, and then you get this response. Okay, you get a response from you. Okay, but let's just stick with the response to sight and hearing, or response to the stand-up comic. First off, as we talked about, there are areas of the brain that manage the hedonistic type of comedy, where it's the limbic and temporal area. And there, you're just laughing involuntarily, or you're laughing from an emotional standpoint. Because again, it's just appealing to the lower brain functions. But now let's say you're a very cerebral comic. And folks, I am trying so hard not to be snobbish, and I know it comes across that way, but this is the science, okay? This is the science of stand-up. All right, so somebody's doing real cerebral comedy, and there, it's going to have to be processed through the prefrontal and frontal cortex. And then that's when you have the more voluntary or thoughtful laughter. So it's sensory input, okay, sensory input. The recipient perceives the humor, and then depending on what kind of humor it is, it'll either go through the involuntary or emotional laughter, or it will go through the voluntary or thoughtful laughter. So in summary, here are the 6 domains of the funny: the hedonistic, the appeal to the pleasure parts of the brain, or appeal to fighting, fleeing, feeding, fornication, all of those things that are controlled by the hypothalamus and such. That's hedonistic. Eudaimonic, that's the storytelling, the good spirit or happiness of a life well lived. The extraordinary, problem solving, differences among us or differences in societies, and then commonalities related to community. These are, in my judgment, the 6 domains of the funny. And I think if you think of humor or comedy or whatever, I think most everything is going to follow within one of these 6 domains. All right, so now that we understand what is funny, or the categorization of what is funny, what's the physiologic purpose of laughter? Why do people laugh? I mean, what's the point of that? I mean, here's an article here. What's so funny? The science of why we laugh. This is in Scientific America 2019. But why is it important that we laugh? Well, first of all, I want to reiterate what I said in a prior YouTube video, and when we talked about the benefits of comedy, or the benefits of humor, is humor can improve capability to manage life stressors. It's a coping mechanism. It can lower stress hormones, the post-encounter stress hormones, such as reduction in epinephrine, that's adrenaline, and cortisol, which is a steroid stress hormone. Those are reduced after the encounter with the humor. May increase endorphins and reduce the perception of pain. Laughter may improve mechanical lung function, may favorably affect the immune system, may favorably affect endothelial function. If you're into preventive cardiology, you're going to want to love to hear that. May improve the mood of hospitalized patients, may help avoid isolation of those with chronic illness and allow for continued integration and involvement with others. Well, folks, that's a good thing. Favorable effects of humor may be humor type specific. For example, self-deprecating humor is usually good. Humor at the expense of others, often not so good. All right, so how is laughter, this thing we do called laughing, how does that help us with survival? What's the connection? Well, I think there's several connections. And I think the sooner we all understand that, I think the sooner we're going to understand that we need to be very, very, very careful in canceling people's ability to laugh or to find humor in things such as tragedy. First of all, I would say that laughter is tied to survival because laughter is a reaction to learning. In fact, I would say that unidirectional or bidirectional learning is the evolutionary link, that unifying link between stimuli and laughter. Both learning and humor involve multiple brain processes where you have sensory input that's processed by both the originator and the recipient. Humor can be the vehicle that drives learning and thus is advantageous from an evolutionary standpoint, right? So if we can make learning fun, if somehow from an evolutionary standpoint, we tie the stimulation of the reward center, which that's exactly what happens with comedy. If you may recall from a prior YouTube video of the science of stand-up, we talked about how it is that comedy stimulates the reward center. That's how it works. If pleasure or humor can be tied with learning, then that's a good thing. That means people want more. They want to learn more, and by learning more, that enhances survival. Why don't you look at the picture over here? Look at these people here. They're learning, aren't they? In the picture, they're learning, but what are they also doing? They're smiling. Why are they smiling? Why would they be smiling while they are learning? Why is that important? Because again, having learning being appealing and stimulating the reward center with smiling and laughing and such, advantageous from a survival standpoint. What about just a baby? I mean, when does this start? Folks, right after birth. Laughter is a reaction to stimuli. Look, you have a baby and you start rattling some keys in front of the baby. Is the baby going through higher cognitive function to try to figure out the intent of the joke? I mean, no, absolutely not. This is just sort of an involuntary response, and it is a manifestation of the pleasure of learning. Okay? So it signals to the parent the enjoyment of a stimuli, learning, to facilitate more learning. So by the baby laughing and such, when you jiggle the keys or whatever, the baby is saying, I find this very interesting what you're doing, and I'm going to respond in a way that demonstrates that this is appealing to me. Now that's kind of breaking down laughing to a granular degree and probably takes all the fun out of it, but folks, that's what I'm talking about. The other thing is, when the baby's laughing, what does that say to the parents? Well, what is the emotion that rises from the parents? Well, the parents start laughing too, right? And they start, it's pleasurable to the parents to hear the baby laugh. So this interaction where the parents are jiggling the keys and the baby is learning, learning how to respond to these sounds and sights and such, when the baby starts to laugh, then that creates a reward to the parent, which facilitates and promotes future stimuli from the parents, and yet more learning. So now the parent says, I want that feeling back. I want to laugh again. I want to enjoy that again, where I'm jingling the keys and the baby laughs and it makes me laugh. I want to do more of that. And as a result, it enhances this bidirectional interactive play between the parent and the baby. And that enhances learning, which enhances survival, which is why it is, from an evolutionary standpoint, advantageous. The bottom line is this: laughter for learning is bidirectional. How important is play to child development? So you say, well, it's a good theory there, but does that really help? Does playing with a child really help in their development? Yes, it does. And that isn't just me speaking. It's the science. This is the science of stand-up. Here's some quotes. This is from Ginsberg, 2007. Play is essential to development because it contributes to the cognitive, physical, social, and emotional well-being of children and youth. Play also offers an ideal opportunity for parents to engage fully with their children. Here's another quote from Yogman. This is in 2018. Pediatricians can play an important role in emphasizing the role of a balanced curriculum that includes the importance of playful learning for the promotion of healthy child development. See the words there? Playful learning. Folks, it's all learning, or excuse me, comedy or humor is the vehicle that drives learning. Humor is the vehicle that drives learning. They're tied together. All right, what's another advantage of laughter in improving survival, or at least from an evolutionary standpoint, or maybe on an individual standpoint? Well, it's an alternative to fight or flight. It's an alternative. How many times have somebody been confronted, and instead of fighting the person, they just laugh at them, right? It's just a natural reaction that we have. Well, I think that's going to enhance your survival if your reaction is going to be laughing as opposed to engaging in physical combat, right? Here's just a illustrative example. Have you ever witnessed a tragedy, or have somebody speak of a tragedy? Or have you ever thought of a tragedy, and as you're doing that, you smiled? Now, if you think about it, that's kind of morbid, isn't it? Why would you laugh at a tragedy? Why would you smile at a tragedy? If you look throughout these series of YouTube videos, I've talked about bad things that have happened to me, or bad things that have happened to other stand-ups. And it's really, they either made a mistake, a really bad mistake, or it was just an embarrassing moment. And as I'm describing it, I smiled. Now, why would I do that? Why would I smile or even laugh sometimes when I'm recounting these tragedies? Folks, that's normal. There isn't anything pathological about it. It's a way that we deal with stress. Because humor can make us make sense of the senseless. For example, the life stressors we talked about, the 7 deadly sins in Dante's Inferno. Comedy or humor can help us deal with these stressors. They can also help us deal with life events. Humor can help make sense of the senseless. Here are event stressors. Instead of interpersonal stressors, here are event stressors. Things like war. Folks, I've been anti-war as long as I can remember. And when I did stand-up, I did a lot of material talking about my opposition to what I consider to be hypocrisy of war. And I know people say, well, aren't you scared about being perceived as anti-military? No, folks, not at all. I can't think of anything that is more pro-military personnel than being anti-war. And certainly, if you think back at some of the things that have happened in some of the wars that we've been in, I mean, I didn't serve in Vietnam or anything like that, but I certainly remember the importance of comedy and the stand-up comics during that time, making fun of the Vietnam War, because That's a war that I think most people would agree now we should have never gotten into. And once we got in, at minimum, we should have had a plan to get out. And we didn't. And that sort of hypocrisy or dismissiveness of the lives of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, folks, we got to do something. And yes, protests were critical at that time to let people know that this cannot stand. But I think that comedy also played a role, an important role.
I think one of the most educational experiences I had through a medical training was I was one time taking care of this VA patient. It's a veteran. And he was lying in a critical care bed, and he had these drips going, and he had a tube in his throat breathing for him. And I walked into the room, and I'm leaned up against the wall, and the rain is kind of rapping on the window. And like I said, it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm looking at the guy, and he's obviously dying. But I didn't want him to believe that. So I kept pumping him up. Hey, everything's looking great, pal. Everything's looking great. I walked outside, and the chaplain says, well, the family kind of wants to talk to this guy. You can ask him if he wants to see them. And so both the chaplain and I walked into the room, and we're standing by the bedside, and the chaplain said, Mr. Jones, your family wishes to speak with you. Would you want to see them? And then there was kind of a communication between the chaplain and the patient that I wasn't really privy to. And for no apparent reason that I saw, the chaplain looked at him and goes, would you like to pray with me? The patient immediately shook his head yes, and he obviously knew he was dying, something of which I was not able to convince him otherwise. So I think at that point I kind of realized kind of where I stood and what my position was in kind of life.
We can't lose that. Folks, we can't lose that. What about atrocities? Genocide, mass killing, torture, rape, death, illness like cancer, disability, injury, depression, suicide, injustice, racism, abuse, neglect, relationships, marriage, divorce, problems with loved ones, financial problems, unemployment, bankruptcy, retirement, theft or betrayal, legal problems, lawsuits and imprisonment, government intrusions or actions, political unrest, business malfeasance, religious intrusions, or all kinds of problems related to sex, procreation, moving, embarrassment, these types of things. All of these, for the individual, can be just devastating. But as devastating as they are for the individual, are we to say now, in 2021, that all of these topics are out of bounds when it comes to comedy? That these things, discussing these things in a comedic way, it is now off limits? That while in the past we used to have a mechanism by which we could somehow make sense of the senseless by applying comedy to these tragedies, that's what we used to be able to do. I'm not sure we're able to do that all the time now. And that's the great struggle that we're in, because people they'll have a vested interest in one of these tragedies, and they'll say, well, you can joke about all the rest of these things all you want, but I'm invested in this one sort of tragedy, and I don't think what you're doing is funny. And it isn't just that they think it's not funny. It's that they're now, when we talked about cancel culture, in the YouTube video discussing cancel culture, it's not that they're just offended, but there are people out there that want people canceled. They want them hurt. They want them harmed professionally, economically, and they want to do so because they're invested in a particular type of tragedy, and they don't feel that should be joked about. Here's just another example. Folks, we're all different. We're all different. Yet, as I mentioned before, each one of these differences, you probably know a joke, or you've heard a stand-up comic tell a joke about each one of these differences. Is that a bad thing? Here's a quote from South Park. Okay, South Park. Either it's all okay or none of it is. Folks, we as a society, we got to make a decision. Are we going to allow people comic license to explore areas that, yes, while it may offend some, on the other hand, for others, it may make sense of the senseless? Or are we going to allow stand-up comics to continue to utilize comedy as a way to relieve stress. So what is off limits? Well, let's get some comic perspectives. Here's George Carlin. I believe you can joke about anything. It all depends on how you construct the joke, what the exaggeration is. Monty Python, this is Michael Palin from Monty Python. Any attempt by authority to say, no, you've got to make sure that we're portrayed in a serious manner is a dangerous thing. And it goes back to what I said before. People that said, well, all these other tragedies, I understand that as a society, we've got to deal with it. And many times the best way to deal with it is through comedy, through humor. But not my tragedy, right? Not the tragedy for which I am most invested. That's the one tragedy for which you cannot joke and for which there can be no comedy, because that's my tragedy. I own that tragedy. Can't be that way, folks. It's either all okay or none of it is. Ricky Gervais. There's no subject you shouldn't joke about. It depends on the target. People get offended when they mistake the subject of a joke with the actual target, and they are not necessarily the same. And that's the point, isn't it? Many times when we do jokes and such and stand-up comedy about tragedy, we're not actually really talking about that tragedy. I mean, that's the obvious implication, but it goes beyond that. In most cases, the actual target, when you talk about a tragedy, is something entirely different. And as was said here, they are not necessarily the same. So how much should you, as a recipient of hearing a joke or seeing a stand-up comic, how much should you be judging other people? And this is where we're in a great debate in 2021. How much is forgiveness a part of you? Let's say that a stand-up comic tells a joke and you're offended. Back in the day, if you were offended, you would just simply say, well, I'm offended by that comic, so I didn't think that particular joke was very funny, and the rest of it was pretty good, so I'm going to let it pass. And then it became, well, I was offended by that joke, and even though the rest of it was pretty funny, I'm never going to watch that comic again, because I don't want to be patronizing someone that makes fun of the tragedy for which I'm invested. Then it became, well, not only am I offended, but I'm so offended that I want to cancel this person so nobody else can hear them. So nobody else can be potentially offended. So I want them canceled. And now where we are is, I'm offended by a joke, and even if the person made a mistake and regrets it, I still want them canceled because I have no capacity for forgiveness. I have no capacity for forgiveness. I'm offended, they need to be canceled, and there is no forgiveness. And that's why there's an entire YouTube video in the science of stand-up regarding forgiveness. Because it is just extraordinary to me how it is that we have people who lack the capacity to forgive. So who's to blame? Well, first of all, I mean, you could just blame the offendophiles, the people who just love to be offended. And that was, the definition of offendophilia was defined in detail in prior YouTube videos of the science of stand-up. So it's the people who are offended. So we could blame them, but I don't know, folks, just because a person's offended and just because somebody says, I want them fired, corporate leaders or organizational leaders don't have to fire anybody, right? That's their decision. And where I think we have a real problem in 2021 is we have these corporate or organizational virtue signaling forgivophobes where they don't much care about forgiving anybody. They just want to get it off their desk, or they want to show to everybody else how virtuous they are. What is a virtue signaling forgivophobe? These are folks, especially in a position of power, who lack forgiveness policies So they don't even have forgiveness policies, which I gave the framework for forgiveness policies in the forgiveness YouTube video. So they lack forgiveness policies, don't even have them. They lack the ability to forgive others on an individual basis, and they cancel or harm others to demonstrate their superior moral character. It's problematic for me, folks. Why? Because, I mean, here's the essential argument. What does it say about a person who jokes about, and then you fill in the blank with a tragedy for which somebody is invested? I think the counterpoint could just as well be, what does it say about a person who cannot forgive a joke decades ago, particularly if a person admitted it was a mistake, and particularly if the person asked for forgiveness? If this joke occurred a decade ago, what does it say about a person who can't forgive somebody like that? And the danger is removing the ability to laugh at tragedy removes a healthful defense mechanism. And I think that's dangerous because, folks, two of the more important ways that we deal with social stresses, or we cope with, coping mechanisms for social stresses, are comedy and sports. And both of them in 2021 have become so politicized that no longer are these the refuge for people who are trying to cope with social stresses. These mechanisms are being taken away because they've become so politicized. Comedy and sports. Now we have, both within comedy and sports, where there's just way too much politics for my liking, not much emphasis on solutions, and all it ends up doing is taking a divided nation and making it even more divisive. Now, I don't see people rallying and unifying when you have folks that are politicizing either sports or comedy. And I'll tell you where the real tragedy is. What are we doing to our athletes? Athletes, that the kind of investment that they have to make and the stresses they have in their life to perform. And now let's say you're a black athlete, an African-American athlete, and you're participating in an activity where you're representing a city or a state or a country. And now you're on the largest stage, and you got all the TVs going, and you got spectators and whatever. And now you're thinking about competing to win, to get the gold medal or whatever. Should you really have to worry about whether or not you should be kneeling? Should you win? Should you really be having to worry, in addition to all the things you have to prepare for? Should you really need to be worrying about what people are going to say about you, whether you kneel or don't kneel? With some people saying, well, she didn't kneel, therefore she's not black enough. Or she did kneel, therefore she's not American enough. Why should anybody have to go through that? Folks, we need to start focusing more on forgiveness and more on solutions and less on canceling people. All right, so finally, the last connection between laughter and survival has to do with communication with other people. I think the evolutionary origin of laughter and comedy could be expressed by Harold Squirrel. You probably heard of thought experiments. Here's one. A squirrel runs in the path of a car. Now, one of two things is going to happen if the squirrel survives. One is the squirrel's going to learn, not going to be running out in front of cars anymore. So that squirrel is going to enter into future gene pools and continue with to influence evolution. On the flip side, squirrel doesn't learn a thing, continues to run out in front of cars, and they're not going to be entering into the future gene pool because they will be dead. They will not survive. What's this have to do with comedy? Well, let's say there's a squirrel, runs out in front of a car. The car barely misses the squirrel. How might the squirrel react? And in this case, I'm speaking as though the squirrel were a person. And the squirrel might go, oh my gosh, oh no, what was I thinking? And the squirrel may be laughing really loud and as a reaction to stress. And then what's going to happen with all the squirrels that are surrounding there? They're going to come up and say, hey, Bob, what are you laughing about? He's going, oh man, did you see that? I almost got run over. I ran right in front of this car over here. And they're like, you're kidding me. And now they're smiling and they're kind of laughing about it. But what does that do? What it does is it communicates what just happened. It communicates a tragedy such that not only might the single squirrel here benefit, but the other squirrels may learn a lesson as well. And maybe they don't go jumping out in front of cars, and it was all facilitated by the vehicular transport of the learning through comedy, through humor. Finally, then there is this. It is the science of stand-up. Got to cover it all, folks. And if we're talking about survival and comedy, it's got to be said, this isn't me. This is an article written, published, Effects of Humor on Interpersonal Attraction and Mate Selection. Quote, results show that the targets with a good sense of humor receive significantly higher ratings of attractiveness and suitability than did those with average or no sense of humor. In other words, you have a better sense of humor, better chance of procreation. So, the evolutionary origin of the funny is that humor and laughter are traits that enhance survival through promoting education, learning, justification, dealing with stressors, and procreation. So I hope you've enjoyed this YouTube video entitled Content and What is Funny. This is yet another in a series of YouTube videos discussing the intersection between the science of stand-up and other sciences. Please click on the subscribe button to add this channel to your subscriptions. Please click on the notification button so you will be notified of future YouTube videos. Click on the like button if you like this video. Click on the share button to share this through email or Twitter or Facebook. And finally, as with the other YouTube videos in the science of stand-up, I'm requesting that you comment on the following questions. What are other examples of basic neural pathways that are relevant to laughter? Now, I gave a very simplistic discussion of the neural pathways related to laughter, but maybe you're a neurobiologist and you have a greater insight. So I'd be interested in what you have to say. Here's one for you, just to show you I'm not as much of a snob as you might think I am. Is all hedonistic stand-up comedy limited to lower brain function? Or can blue comedy be smart comedy? I think it probably can. I mean, you have to be really good at it. You have to do something different other than just tell bathroom jokes and such, but I'd be interested in your viewpoint. So thank you. Again, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Louisville Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center, and you've been watching yet another YouTube video on the science of stand-up.